Ladies and gentlemen, my niece was once asked to point out Europe on a globe in primary school. Difficult one. But after a moment of consideration, she lit up and she started turning the globe. Europe, that's where all the small countries are, right? Indeed, Europe is the small countries. And we're becoming the small countries in more than just the geographical sense. In the past year, I've sometimes felt that I'd been beamed back in time into the worst parts of the 20th century. Runaway inflation, reopening of coal plants, trench wars, nuclear threats. War returning to the European continent is just one of many developments that are calling into question the world order that was established by the end of the Cold War. Russia, once on a path to democracy, now an authoritarian state, suppressing its own people, seeking influence with military aggression. In Asia, the emerging economies have now truly emerged. They're industrial powerhouses with dominant positions in some of the critical industries. The US, once a champion of free trade, is reshoring its industries, externally embroiled in an escalating international conflict, standoff. Internally, deep rifts polarizing the country, leaving doubts over the long-term direction. And Europe stands somewhere in the middle. And over time, demographic developments may entrench our position as the small countries. Germany, the most populous country in Europe, represents only 1% of global population. And in a bit more than 50 years, ladies and gentlemen, this is what the world will look like according to demographics. To some extent, economic dynamics may follow. A new balance of power is emerging, ladies and gentlemen, and we need to avoid that small also means weak. Easier said than done. For decades, we have worked for democracy, for trade, global cooperation, within the framework of a rule-based international order. Many of these virtues are now under pressure. Dark clouds of climate change are gathering. Action is stalling. Biodiversity in decline. Protectionism on the rise. More than 100 countries have adopted trade restrictions in the last 3 years. 100. Indonesia has a ban on nickel exports. China is mulling a ban on exports of silicon wafers. There are talks of a lithium OPEC, and the US is imposing wide-ranging trade restrictions. It seems that the economic mantra is changing. For many years, it was just in time. Now it seems to be just in case. The energy transition involves a huge shift from a fuel-intensive to a raw material-intensive economy. We need massive amounts of raw materials, massive amount of industrial products to succeed in this transition. In a world with ideological rivalry, geopolitical tensions, it's critical that we learn from our mistakes. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, how did it happen that we got so dependent on Russian gas? How? Well, let's have a look. For sure, the annexation of Crimea in 2014 should have been a wake-up call, but Europe was still reeling from the financial crisis. In North Africa, we had the Arab Spring. And in Japan, the Fukushima accident had cast doubts over the role of nuclear in our transition. We didn't make things easier for ourselves. Some countries adopted a ban on onshore wind, retroactive changes to support systems, loads of red tape for developers. Wasn't easy. Before we knew it, migration crisis, then came Brexit, the year after Trump was sworn in, and that, ladies and gentlemen, that was the backdrop for the 19 elections in the European Parliament. And then, COVID. Long story short, policymakers had plenty of things on their plate. Industry was left with limited options. The question, however, remains, how do we get back to the future without repeating the mistakes of the past? The good news, energy independence and climate action are to a large extent complementary. Even if the current turmoil complicates things in the short term, it clarifies things in the long term. And I'm convinced that we have the tools, the technologies, and the will to achieve our goals. Last year, we've shown that we could take bold steps to save energy, that we could diversify exports, imports, that we could build out renewables at unseen pace. So how do we now take the next steps? How do we scale solutions, deliver progress on the ground here and now for a strong, competitive, net zero Europe? Well, that's what you're here to tell us. And can I just say it's great to see so many of you. This year we have a record of 600 registered participants for the Power Summit. So really look forward to the discussions in the coming 2 days. So let me close the speech and open up the summit with the following. In the new balance of power, homegrown electricity is industrial power, is political power. And let's be clear, electricity needs to be reliable. That means renewables, but it also means a system that can integrate renewables. Infrastructure, flexible, firm capacity, ladies and gentlemen. In the new balance of power, the strength of the small countries flows from the unity, from our cooperation, and from our commitment to our values, freedom and fairness, and planetary stewardship. In the new balance of power, ladies and gentlemen, we need to stay the course. We need to lead the way back to the future. Let's do this for the world, for Europe, and for all our nieces and nephews out there. Thank you.